So now we present Herbert Grassmann, Professor Herbert Grassmann, and he will be the chair for Stephen Porges. All people know Stephen and his work, so I leave the word to Herbert and to Stephen. Thank you for being here. And we listen to you both.
Okay, thank you, Maurizio. Well, it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce Stephen Porges. You might know all him, but anyway, I would like to say something about him because he transformed our understanding of our autonomic physiology. He's a scientist at the university, at the Kinsey Institute in Indiana University, and a professor for psychiatry at the University of North Carolina. And he's the founder of the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium, which I have the pleasure to work as a colleague with you since last year, to find out more about trauma and how therapists are handling with the trauma. So let's start with the beginning question of what does the polyvagal theory brings to the clinical world? So maybe we start with this question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I decided not to give a talk because giving talks creates social distance.
Okay.
And I wanted to have a dialogue, which brought me closer to both the participants and with Herbert.
That's fine.
So the very relevant question is, what does polyvagal theory bring to the clinical world? And I kind of summarize this in kind of a phrase that it changes our personal narrative from being a narrative of events to being a narrative of feelings. So it focuses on bodily feelings and not necessarily events. This becomes critical when we start talking about trauma and where trauma gets so focused on events and not on our responses to the event. So polyvagal theory focuses on that physiological autonomic shift. And the model of the polyvagal theory is that that physiological shift affects how we relate, how we perceive, how we respond to the world. It is that missing intervening variable between the stimulus outside the body and our responses to the context.
Yeah, great. So you sent me a slide, and on this slide it's standing, I feel, therefore I am. That's what you're just saying.
Yeah.
And I try to translate it in Italian. Mi sento quindi sono. I hope this is correct.
Of course, it's a paraphrase of Descartes' statement, which he said, I think, therefore I am. Je pense donc je suis, my poor French. And I was playing with that and started to think about, what if he said, I feel my body, je me sens, using the reflexive form of the word to feel, which means to feel inside the body. In English, we tend not to use that word. We use feel, which is non-discriminatory whether it's inside or outside. But I'd like to speculate, what would our world be like if he had said, I feel my body, I feel inside myself, therefore I am. So a journey of embodiment versus a journey where we focus on intellectual cognitive thoughts. We actually are numbing our body, we become disembodied. And of course, we have to do both, and that is the journey that we're all on, which is both a bottom-up respect and a top-down exploration.
Yeah, so I like this phrase. So we're talking about a situation also right now in the US where you said we have two pandemics going on. So maybe you share a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, the first pandemic is obvious. It's the COVID-19 virus. But the second pandemic is that in responding to the threat of the virus, we have removed ourselves from social interaction. And we have to do that to reduce the risk of catching the virus. But to our bodies, to our nervous system, interactions with others is how we functionally mitigate or deal with our own disruptions or feelings of threat. It's really the history, the evolutionary history of mammals, and that is how comforting and co-regulation with another appropriate mammal is how our bodies give up our defenses and allow our nervous system to support health, growth, and restoration, homeostatic processes. So two pandemics, the one that's in the newspapers, and the other one, which is what we feel in our body. And there'll be a third one, which is the consequence of being isolated and being under feelings of threat for so long, which will retune our autonomic nervous system and make it more difficult for many of us to become spontaneously accessible and interactive with other people.
So this leads me to our first article you wrote in, I think, back in April. And it's about the question, how is remote therapy working? So maybe we talk a little bit about that.
Excuse me, how is what working?
Remote therapy.
Oh, remote therapy. This is a question I frequently get, but we could ask the same question. How is remote conferencing working?
Yeah.
Or why do we go to
conferences in the moment? Yeah. So how is that working? Yeah.
Yeah. Why do we go to conferences? Well, we say on one level to learn, but really on the other level, we go to conferences to relate to other people, to create networks, to have shared experiences. So, but we learn over time that with remote learning and remote therapy, that these are portals in which we can optimize how they function. And part of what I learned by doing interviews and workshops and talks online is I started to wear glasses. So I I don't wear glasses, but I have reading glasses. And I realized that if I put the glasses on, I can attend to the upper parts of people's faces better.
Wow.
And so in polyvagal theory, the upper part of the face is critical, the orbicularis oculi, because it's really broadcasting the physiological state of the person with the intonation of their voice. So I'm using cues. So I'm looking at you, Herbert, and I am feeling more connected. If I take them off and I get a blur, it doesn't quite work the same way. The optimal positioning of our cameras isn't right. My camera's too high. And if the camera were more at eye level, we'd get more of that bodily reaction of connectedness. So let's go back to the therapy question. And it's a double-edged question, especially in the world of trauma treatment. Many clients say that many therapists say that their clients actually like remote therapy better. Now, let's start with what that means from a polyvagal perspective. It means that they're in a predictable physical space that is safer to them. So their body is less vigilant about the cues around them. And so they actually can relax more, assuming they have a quiet, nice room in their own home. On the other part, they feel they have the attention of the therapist that's not being deviating from them. And they also have the opportunity to turn off the therapist's camera or to tell the therapist to turn off their camera to help them regulate their physiological state. So they're given more agency in the interaction of the therapist with the client. And the feedback is really saying it's not bad. So many of their clients are progressing much better than they had expected. And also therapists are starting to understand what it is to do remote therapy. And in a sense, just like I had to learn what it was to give remote interviews, put your glasses on, attend, be available. Being present with your client is critical because we all know what happens if I gaze avert and look at my watch. Our body gets a reaction, a neuroception of someone that's dismissive of us. And so there's a lot of responsibility on the therapist to understand that their cues are really being picked up. And initially, the feedback I was getting from therapists was, this is exhausting, because they were trying to stay on it. And I think the underlying secrets of human interaction, which is really a sense of accessibility and presence with another, can be kind of, we can use the video conferencing for that if we're really know what our aim is. Part of the problem has been we've used two-dimensional screens for entertainment and for education. So we got used to them as not being a portal of personal connection. And I'm saying it's the best we have now. It's not so bad. Exploit it for what it is.
So you mentioned neuroception. So maybe you can say one of two sentences about what do you mean when you talk about neuroception?
Neuroception is a term. It's a made-up term. It's unique to polyvagal theory. It's a term I needed to come up with to define what our nervous system does in evaluating risk and safety outside the realm of awareness. I would have liked to have used the word perception. I started to use that, and then I said, that's a real trap, because if someone doesn't detect a predator cue, they're going to start blaming themselves for not perceiving it, because perception implies a level of awareness and cognition, at least for some people. So I wanted to create a new word which gave the responsibility to the nervous system and not to our conscious awareness. And we respond with neuroception all the time. A loud noise, we get startled long before we know what that noise is. So the appraisal comes after the reaction. And neuroception is that immediate reaction. And that immediate reaction can trigger accessibility if the cues are like a prosodic voice, a voice that's melodic, a smiling face. We may just become like this. A baby who's crying, who hears her mother singing, may just stop crying and becoming calm. If you have a dog as a pet, you know what I'm talking about, because you can talk to your dog with this prosodic voice, and the dog gives up all its hypervigilance.
Interesting. Let's talk a little bit more about the second article, because it's more empirical. And you ask, what does a trauma history brings up to the table in people who are experiencing pandemic?
Yeah. So we conducted a relatively large survey study in the United States with about 1,700 people. And we asked these questions. We measured with the childhood trauma questionnaire and with an adversity questionnaire. We wanted to know what their history was. And we used my body perception questionnaire as a surrogate measure for autonomic regulation. And we looked at outcomes during the pandemic: anxiety, depression, worry. And the bottom line is, we would start off with a first take home, is that trauma history is a pre-existing condition. So we talk about vulnerability to COVID, we talk about vulnerability to the disease as having a pre-existing condition. If you have certain other ailments, you're more likely to get the virus. What the paper really says is that if you have a trauma history, you're more likely to be mentally affected by the pandemic for you. So even if you take that model, and that is trauma history, again becomes this initial statement that Herbert asked me, and that is, what does polyvagal theory bring to the clinical world?
Yeah.
And trauma history is events. But if you now ask the next question about that person's autonomic nervous system, their system of feelings, if the trauma history affected or retuned their autonomic nervous system so that their autonomic nervous system was now in states of defense, or more chronically in states of defense, more likely to have more sympathetic, more fight-flight reactions, and more gut problems of this older dorsal vagus, those individuals had worse outcomes during the pandemic, meaning they were affected mentally or psychologically more. And in fact, if you use partial out the influence of autonomic state, then trauma history becomes very weakly related to the effect of the pandemic. So it's really, event shifts my autonomic nervous system, it retunes, and now my body's in a chronic state of threat. And what are the outcomes of my body being in a state of threat? Anxiety, depression, or PTSD symptomatology, and chronic worry about the pandemic.
And this has consequences also when we look to therapy, somatic therapy.
Yeah. So the issue of finding that relationship is not necessarily a deterministic, pessimistic one. It actually has a degree of optimism to it because it says, here's a portal. What would happen if our interventions targeted to retune autonomic function? In a sense, enabling the body to give up its threat reactions and to feel calmer and more accessible. And that's really what somatic-oriented therapies do, and that's what the emerging group of polyvagal informed therapies do. They focus on that intervening variable physiological state, and they basically let the mental experiences sit on the table, and they then try to calm the body down. And then when the body becomes calm, it processes these events in a different way.
Mm. So what would you recommend for clinicians in that way when they work with high traumatized people?
Well, the part is, if you work with trauma or trauma survivors, you have to be we used a couple of words here, trauma informed, neurobiologically informed, or polyvagal informed. You have to have an understanding and a respect for the physiology of your clients. And that respect goes even beyond that. It means you have to be aware, and you have to understand that listening to a person's voice, looking at their face, evaluating their muscle tone and their posture are profound, potent cues of their physiological state. And you have to be mindful, and you have to honor the client's physiological state before you start getting into anything about evaluating their history. And your job as a therapist is really the job of a co-regulator. You are the person in the relationship that is now supporting and witnessing and trying to enable the physiological state of your client to give up its threat reactions and become accessible.
So that means for the therapist, sometimes it's not easy to be in this position because we have a lot of questions, or we have our goals for treatment. So how could we as a therapist prepare ourselves in order to be more sensitive for that?
Again, these are good questions, and the issue is the therapist has to honor and be aware of their own physiological state. So in the model that we're describing, it's not merely the client, it's the fact that you're creating a co-regulatory relationship, and you're broadcasting and receiving cues with the client of your physiological state and how that bounces off the client. Yeah. So what may appear to be intentionally doing something you think is right or good may result in a shift in physiology in your client. And that shift in physiology is a shift from being present to being threatened and defensive. And you have to be very careful and aware of that, and which means you have to understand how to support an individual who has a trauma history.
Yeah. So I just remember then when we do our research collaboration, we have in the first phase asked also our therapist about this kind of question, isn't it? Yeah. About their background and their childhood, to know where they come from.
Yeah, so Herbert and the European Association of Body Psychotherapy and the US Association of Body Psychotherapy are collaborating with the Traumatic Stress Research Consortium, in which we are, in a sense, learning about their constituency. And, who are their therapists? Who are therapists who become somatic-oriented therapists? What's their background? And one of the questions is, what's your trauma history? And, okay, so when we did this research, I was actually surprised that the percentage wasn't as high as I thought it would be, because my dialogue with trauma therapists is that most of them tend to have a trauma history, and it leads them into the work. But it's really closer to 40 to 50%. And what we learn from these surveys is that this trauma history gets them interested in helping people with trauma and an awareness of it. And the next level question we asked them was really, does this history help you with doing therapy? And they feel that it does, because it gives a different type of authenticity in their relationship with their clients. One of the other things, we asked this, I would say, I'm just going to say it's not a sophisticated question, but we asked people, why are they doing this work? Because it's hard work, working with people with trauma. And they obviously were not doing it to make money. Their primary goals was to help people. It's really a beautiful expression of benevolence and compassion of the therapist. And then another question in this survey that I found really interesting was, are you suffering from burnout? So you ask this type of question, if you work with people with severe trauma, how much can you take? And the interesting part was they weren't. So in general, they weren't. So what it meant was that they had, in a sense, deciphered or understood the actual formula of co-regulation. So their interactions with people with trauma were, in a way, making them feel better about themselves, and they were not absorbing their clients' traumas. So I've heard from other therapists that they absorb the trauma. Now, this becomes an interesting dialogue, because if you interact with people with trauma, they often don't want to tell you about the trauma. Why? Because it will make you feel bad. And they don't want their narrative to be hurting someone else. They want to protect you. And so what we're seeing is that with virtually all the therapists in the survey, hearing the narratives of their clients isn't really disrupting them. In a way, it's even motivating them.
Interesting, yeah.